Everybody, welcome to Get Smarter and Make Stuff podcast. Today is Friday, May 21st in 2021, and I am really happy to invite someone onto the show today that I knew from the minute I sort of conceived the show. You know, you talk about getting smarter and making things, that I would want to talk to this person. We've worked together before. We've had a lot of chance to have conversations in long car rides and at conferences and whatnot. But I know he'll have super interesting things to say about our two questions. I'm referring at length to my friend, former coworker, and person I really respect, Michael Fogus. Welcome to the show, Fogus.
Hi. I realized you said getting smarter and making stuff. I thought the name of this podcast was getting less dumb and breaking stuff.
Well, as practiced by me, that is an entirely accurate statement of the way that this thing goes down. In fact,
yeah, that's more my speed too.
Right. I've actually joked that a lot of times it feels like getting dumber and breaking stuff, but we'll settle for getting less dumb for sure.
Yeah, if you don't feel like you're getting dumber, then you're not doing it right.
Yeah. So here's a great one. I want to spend the bulk of the show talking to you, but you just remind the thing that's completely driving me insane right now. So I have this thing I'm doing that requires that I have two pulleys that are connected by a belt, and they're what are called synchronous pulleys. They're GT2, they're toothed pulleys, and the belt has teeth in it. Mm-hmm. And one of the pulleys has 36 teeth, and the other one has 24 teeth. It's an intentionally in a 3-to-2 relationship. And what I'm finding right now is that if I disconnect it from everything and just slowly rotate one of the pulleys by hand, that they rotate in a relationship that is more like 16-to-11 than 3-to-2, which, if you think about it a little bit, is basically impossible.
Yeah, that seems like an odd ratio there.
Yeah. It's anyway. So I mean, I don't know. I might wind up I've been doing a video series about this thing called the electronic lead screw, and I might have more to say about this sometime. But definitely, just the reason I mention it is because that is making me feel really stupid right now, looking at it and going, I cannot understand how it seems to not be slipping and yet not engaging in a 3-to-2 relationship. It seems like it would have to do that. So yeah, I know the feeling. So, I mean, like I said, you were one of the people that I had in mind right off the bat. You know, actually, I have quite a lengthy list of people that I was thinking of talking to, but you were very high up on it, which is why you were here appearing as whatever this is, show number 6 or something like that. And so, I mean, I think I've mentioned this to you, but I'll just say it again. You know, we really only have 2 questions on the show with a bonus one at the end. And the 2 questions are something along the lines of what are you making and what are you learning, or what have you made and what have you learned, or how do you what do you think about making and learning? And so, I think you have really interesting things to say about that. Although I'm sure you'll demur in your usual Fogus, humble way. But I wonder whether I could steer us towards one of those questions in particular to start with. I'm sure we'll hit on both. We always do. But I am actually really interested to reverse the usual order and ask you the question, what are you learning? Like what it's because I think you have a really interesting, a really disciplined approach, a really thorough approach, an approach that I, would like to emulate around how you acquire new knowledge. Like you're always reading, for instance. So I'm just kind of really curious to hear if there's anything that you are learning or have learned recently, or maybe not recently, that caught your fancy that you want to talk about.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned that I have a discipline around this, and I do to some degree, but when I step back and think about it, it's mostly just following whatever my fancy is for any given moment. But the number of things that I tend to be interested in are I found are very small, and the way that they intersect is really where I like to live and when I'm learning things. Interested in technology and philosophy. In fact, that's really where my focus has been lately. But the arts and just the simple act of playing, right? And so when I think about what I'm going to learn, I tend to gravitate towards things that really kind of hit one or more of those things at once. And so lately, in fact, I was driven by reading this great book by Trisha Rhodes. It's called Black Noise. It has a subtitle too. I can't remember it. And in it, she talks about hip hop and rap and the, the the genesis of these things and she really looks at it from a philosophical bent. What does it mean and what's driving hip hop and rap and what were the motivating factors throughout its history and that philosophical bent really appealed to me, and so I kind of looked for other things along that line, and so I came upon this focus of study that people are really engaging in and earning PhDs in. It's called metal studies. Have you heard of metal studies?
I think the only reason I have is because you tweeted about it, and I happened to see your tweet. I have to say though, I am not even remotely surprised. It is a anyway. I'll let you talk more about it. It certainly sounds interesting.
Well, metal studies is definitely not speaking of metallurgy, but,
right.
Heavy metal studies, and the reason that I find this fascinating is for well, one, I never really got into metal deeply. I hit the fringes, and certainly have favorite bands, and
Well, that's interesting to me because you were in a punk band.
I was
right, and the relationship between punk and metal is, I mean, there's a lot of deep similarities. I think everything from the sort of attitude, right? Like at least the I don't know, traditional is the word, but there's been a strong current in metal and lyrics and the culture and whatnot of like independence from authority, and of course there's the fact that the music is fast and relies a lot on heavy percussion and distortion, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, I was at a concert one time, and there was a couple older guys. They're older than me at the time. It was a while back, and they were commenting on how the things that people call metal now, they would have called punk not that long before that. Anyway, sorry, but you were talking about metal, and it just strikes me as interesting to hear you say that you weren't that into metal, given how into punk you. I mean, they're different things, and certainly one can be into one without being into the other. So, didn't mean to jump on you there.
No, not at all. And I think that as I get into this more, I think that there are more similarities than I had ever realized. Interestingly, the reason that I heard about metal studies is through a podcast interview with someone named David Burke, who is a professor at Bath University, Bath Spa University. I can't remember that.
Okay.
And he was really riveting interview to listen to, and he touches on this a little bit, and I think that one big difference between historically anyway, between metal and punk is that their focus of the focus of their music and their lyrics, and whereas punk historically was more politically focused, metal was and typically is more focused on death and finitude and the like.
Yeah, it is more individual, I think.
Yeah, and that focus on death is very often reflected upon the artists themselves, and they ponder their own deaths and the death of the universe, and so this stepping back a second, I started in university as a philosophy and math major, and somewhere along the that path, I diverged and went into computer science instead.
Sure.
Uh, and so a lot of what I know about philosophy is maybe freshman, sophomore, and junior level of understanding,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of it doesn't have a grounding in more modern philosophy and current thinking. And so, looking at the landscape of philosophy and wanting to get back into uh, researching that or just learning more about it, it's so vast and uh, frankly just daunting to look at the wall of ideas, of the great ideas in the history of humankind, and and try to make something of that and try to take a run at it and make sense of it. And so looking at what David Burke's perspective was is that he could we could use heavy metal music as sort of a lens to view philosophy, and so that kind of appealed to me because it gives me one a view of more recent ideas, and it lets me trim down the possible things that I could look into, which is important because this is definitely I'm not doing this as a graduate study. It's sort of for fun, and so trying to learn both music and philosophy at the same time, using this as the lens to do it with.
Huh. That you yeah, that's super interesting. I have to say, if I was to pick amongst my friends the person who was most likely to say, I want to learn philosophy and I'm going to do it through the lens of metal, I somehow that's you. Somehow that's you. So that's super interesting. How's it going? I mean, are you deep into this yet, or are you like just getting started, or where are you at with it all?
No, so when I first tweeted about it, it was maybe I don't know a month ago, perhaps. So I'm a month into it, and really what I'm where I'm at right now is building a list of avenues to explore, uh, downloading music from Amazon and listening to it, uh, listening to perspectives on this stuff, and kind of reading uh, a survey or two of the landscape to try to get a better idea of where I can go with this. And right now I'm reading a book that's called in what is it? In the Dust of This World by
That's a
an
great
author
name.
by an author named Eugene Thacker, and the subtitle is "Horror of Philosophy," and it's a different, it's not the philosophy of horror as in
Hmm.
horror movies and horrible ideas and horrible things, but more of uh, this idea that the universe doesn't care about us, and in fact is probably open is hostile towards human life, uh, and framing that within the perspective of horror movies and horror literature, weird fiction, and heavy metal music.
Interesting. So if I have this, if I'm going to guess, but it sounds like the premise there is that the increasing realization, the advancement and understanding of the universe leads to a sort of reaction in society that gives rise to things like horror movies, things, I mean, the apocalyptic stuff like zombie movies, and the themes in the various genres of metal. Because of course you talked about death, and of course that brings to mind death metal, which is its own family of subgenres, since metal is
Mm-hmm.
endlessly subdivided into microgenres. There are plenty of genres that are little or less, at least less to do with death, but there's plenty of that as well. So is that the basic idea though, that like as we sort of figure out how the universe works, it's leading us to go, Huh. And then write a lot of horror. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think I haven't. I certainly haven't finished the book yet. I'm about 3/4 of the way through, but I think that's where he's leading. I think that he's uh, trying to explain this feeling of bleakness in the products that stem from it.
Mm.
I don't know what the punchline is. I don't.
Sure.
It's only volume 1, so I still have 2 volumes to go.
So
I don't think I'll come to an answer in this one.
Okay, no worries. I saw actually a reader of the blog, possibly a listener to this podcast, but someone who was on the Get Smarter Make Stuff website suggested to me a video series. I'm going to look it up actually while I'm sitting here. It is called Awakening. The series is called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and it's a lecture series by a professor, I believe, of philosophy. But it sounds like the kind of thing you might want to add to your queue. I'll mention it because I've been really enjoying it. It was, like I said, recommended to me by a one of the community here. And essentially, I'm not done with it either. But he's been going through and talking about how, kind of in modern society, there is a gravitation towards certain things. So, for instance, meditation would be one example, right? Like that's a thing that is becoming more and more popular. And he relates it to this thing called the meaning crisis. Like, what does it mean? Like, what does life mean? But he takes it all the way back to the upper Paleolithic transition, which is, this part in our history. It's prehistory, where there was a change in the way that we organize society, and there's another change, around 800 BC, and then there was another change around the time that we invented money, and the impact that these various things had on human cognition. Things like I'm like spraying all these terms. It's actually well structured, but it ties all these things together, including things like shamanism, like the notion that historically the shaman's job was to reach altered states of consciousness through things like fasting or meditation or ritual that involved a lot of repetition, so that you could, that's right, psychedelics as well, so that you could solve problems that could not be solved with the more conscious part of your brain, to reach an altered state of consciousness. It's super interesting. It's a little bit aside from what you seem to be pursuing, but it feels like it's not entirely disjoint. You might like it.
Well, it sounds interesting, and based on your description, it sounds like there may be something in there that could help me along my journey.
Yeah.
So I've already forgotten the title, but I'll look it up.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes. It's called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, but I'll shoot you a link and it'll be there.
Cool.
So sorry. So yeah. So this is really interesting. Your journey. You mentioned you mentioned that book. And you mentioned a little bit about what you've found there. I guess I'm wondering. Well, a couple things really. One is the specific. Like, have you so far had any realizations or come to any conclusions or had things pointed out to you that you were especially pleased with or found surprising or that resonated with you? Like any sort of, oh wow, this journey has already kind of paid off because now I know X.
Well, yeah, I think that's happening all of the time because, as I mentioned, my background in the philosophy angle here is weak at best, and so I'm the whole branch of existentialism / nihilism in philosophy is a complete black box to me. And so this is really opening up that whole subcategory of philosophy to me. And as I mentioned, it turns out that I like metal more than I thought I would.
Any favorites so far that like new favorites, something you can counter that you really like?
Well, I'm a relative noob, but one that I really enjoy is a band called Nile. Have you heard of Nile?
I'm not sure. I listen to a lot of music kind of on random shuffle. I actually have this playlist that I highly recommend. It's not my playlist; it's a playlist on Spotify called "The Sound of Everything," which
Mm-hmm.
contains one song from every genre that Spotify has. So it's about 1,200 songs, and it's everything from you might get a love ballad in Spanish, and then a podcast, and then there's a lot of metal, obviously, since there's a bunch of those genres.
Yeah.
Anyway, so point being, I can't recall that band in particular, but given that my Spotify favorites filled up when I hit 50,000, there's a good chance I've heard them at least once.
Oh well, they were the ones that came on and were really fast tempo and growling screams. Do you
Oh,
remember
thanks.
that?
Thanks for narrowing that down for me. I appreciate that. Yeah.
No, the thing that I find interesting about them, and I've now talked about all of uh, this nihilistic bent, is that they don't seem to do that at all. In fact, almost all of their music and is written telling stories about ancient Egypt,
Mm.
and I don't know. I find that really kind of fascinating. That's another topic that I know very little about. So maybe that's another path for another day.
Yeah, I've kind of um, come across ancient Egypt a couple times in my own various studies recently, and one of the interesting things that gets pointed out in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is that the entire society exists before at least one of these cognitive transitions we've had, and so one of the things he points out is that if you read stories from before about, I want to say 800 AD, they don't resonate, right? Like they're not stories that you would find in like modern times. They're
Mm-hmm.
just they're just fundamentally different in some way. And I'm going to do a very poor job of describing this. And then after this point in time, and it feels like it might be later than 800 AD, the stories that you find are actually ones that you can relate to, right? You know, the stuff that's going down in 200 AD or whatever, you know, you're like, oh yeah, that's the kind of story that somebody might write in modernity. Um, and ancient Egypt entirely obviously exists entirely in that period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the whole thing, and even to the point where like the writing system is quite different to other systems that come after. Anyway, so I find that it to me it's a complete black box. I know almost nothing about it, but the notion that um, you had this vast empire that existed for, I believe, thousands of years. Yes,
Yeah, as far as I believe so. Yeah.
right. So like way longer than certainly any of the modern nation states. You know, China lays claim to 4,000 years of civilization. So on that order, perhaps.
Right.
But like that, it's all in this world where it was actually not just a different uh, landscape from the standpoint of technology or whatever, but actually possibly cognitively different. Like people like fundamentally thought in a different way than people even from the you know the the Roman era, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, super interesting. Yeah, so ancient Egypt in the music, cool stuff. Um, so I mean that's awesome. I think what you're talking about. I was just thinking to myself today, yet again, I have a 10-gallon agenda that fits into a 2 microliter schedule, right?
Yeah.
And this, not to mix my units, isn't it great to be an American where I can talk about liters and gallons in the same sense? Um, uh, but I'm actually also, I mean, and so that's super interesting. I'm also curious though to hear about not just the interesting things you come across, but also your process on learning. Like so you sat down and said, I have this goal to learn about the intersection of heavy metal and philosophy, and like I think I know you well enough to know that you probably had a go-to way of doing that, and I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. Like, I mean, obviously you've mentioned a couple books and whatnot, but do you have like a larger plan or framework or set of techniques that you're like, I'm going to use this, and that's definitely going to help me get where I'm going?
Yeah. I besides note taking, nothing really jumps to mind. I want to clarify that I am interested in the intersection between metal and philosophy, but I would probably say that the metal side of it uh, is a way of focusing my bigger
Gotcha.
goal of learning more, filling in the holes in my understanding of philosophy.
Gotcha.
And it's a nice distraction, right? It allows me to discover two things at once, right?
Sure. Yeah, well, constraints are good, right? I know you and I have had that conversation before where, constraints are helpful in creativity and I
Mm-hmm.
guess in discovery and whatever. So, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thanks for explaining.
Yeah, and it's all about lenses for me. I like to view things through the lens of something else, and so a lot of the, the coding projects that I'm interested in tend to be uh, take a language and make it do something else that doesn't really it doesn't do by default.
Hmm.
And so that's why I've always been drawn to Lisp languages because it's the ultimate uh, clay.
Sure.
You can turn it into whatever you want. And so whenever I'm studying, I'm trying to accomplish more than one thing at a time. So I have these things that I draw and these Venn diagrams. I think you might have seen one
Yes.
or two of them. And so I'm always trying to think of what what really interests me or what I really want to work on. And so uh, you know the larger bubbles themselves are interesting, and I'm into things that fall into those larger bubbles. But I'm always compulsively drawn to the intersections.
Well, why is that? Is that so that you can just like get more done? In other words, you're learning about metal and you're learning about philosophy. I'm advancing on two fronts, or is it that it's an intersection, or is it something along the lines of like historically there have been super interesting advancements that have been made when multidisciplinary convergences happen, or what is it about that draws you to that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the last thing that you said. I
Mm,
think that the convergence of two different viewpoints, two or more different viewpoints, is where you want to live. That's 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 where interesting things happen. I mean, obviously, um, there's pure mathematics, right? And a lot of there's a lot of interesting things happening in pure mathematics. But for me, it's more interesting when mathematics uh, is coupled with something else, like computing or brain science, right?
mhm,
And that actually leads me into something else that I've been really kind of interested in along this philosophy bent is
mhm.
that going back and looking at the works of Alan Turing and
Oh yeah.
and and viewing him not exclusively as a mathematician or uh, the progenitor of computer science, but as a philosopher, and that's been fascinating to me because I up until recently I had a storybook understanding of Alan Turing and his work, and I don't know, I don't claim to be an expert. I don't claim to uh, say that I fully understand his works and his impact, but I now realize that I know less than I thought I did, and that's valuable.
Hmm. Yeah, getting smarter is part of it is realizing that you're not as smart as you want to be, right?
Right? Yeah.
So I'm curious though. Say more about that. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners are, have some experience with or are in the some engaged in software in some sense. So may have some awareness of Turing. My understanding is certainly well down the end of the spectrum that you were just alluding to. Right? In other words, I don't know very much about Turing. So when you say viewing him as a philosopher, can you say more about what his philosophy was or how his works are philosophic in nature?
Sure, I'll try my best. I think that Turing is fascinating because almost everything that he did or thought of was cross discipline in some way, and
Hmm.
so he's famous. He's famous for many things, but there's a few things that stand out, and one is his work at Bletchley Park, decoding German uh, codes in World
Mm-hmm.
War II, right?
Yep.
And so uh, you can think about that as a purely mathematical problem, which he was a genius, a mathematical genius of the highest order, and so he was equipped to do that. But I think in order to properly break codes, the way that he did is to also view it as a psychology problem, a psychological problem,
Mm.
and that is, what is it about these codes that allows them to be breakable? Because a human created them and devised the way that these messages are encoded,
Interesting.
and so there's something in the nature of the human that created these codes that allows him to then go and find the weaknesses in the code and break.
Mm-hmm. So psychology is an attack vector, essentially.
I think so. I think so. And uh, I I find that fascinating, right? Because as a programmer myself, it's really easy to get lost in the bits,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And it's it's hard to remember and to uh, synthesize the idea that uh, coding is just one aspect of a psychological problem.
Yes. Totally. Yeah, and in fact, even the whole idea of code, right? Like, in software, we're obsessed with writing code. We're obsessed with the activity of typing in code and what language you. I mean, to the point where you ask someone, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm a JavaScript programmer. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
am." Right?
Mm-hmm.
But the computer does not care about JavaScript. The computer does not care about Clojure. The computer does not care about C. Like all of those things are for humans, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose there are interpreted languages, but even there, it's not fundamentally anything but a mechanism that is intended for people to read and write, and very importantly, to read, right? Like, in fact, I think I've worked with a number of great engineers in my time, um, and the really good ones are separated from the merely good by their ability to know that software engineering is almost exclusively a team sport, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like if you do a great thing, which is funny because it's really counter to the prevailing stereotype, right? Which is the lone young white male programmer, alone by themselves, like doing great things with a computer. And of course, it's not that at all, right? Like a lot of us are not young. An unfortunately small number of us are not white or male, but that, they're certainly present. And when we work, we're working with other people, like intensely working with other people. And even if you write something by yourself, ultimately someone else is going to consume it. That person might be you 6 months from now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that person is a different person. But yeah, sorry to kind of go off on a tear there, but I just something that I feel in very strong agreement with you on.
Yeah, I think that you've got it. I think you understand it, and I couldn't agree more. And
Yeah,
and
I've
this is
go ahead.
this is why I find Turing so fascinating, because he does bridge these different disciplines.
Super
and
interesting.
and so let's stick with Turing for one
Hmm.
more thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Another uh, another thing that he's famous for is devising uh, the Turing test, right?
Yep.
And so briefly, the Turing test is uh, the idea that if you can develop a program, an artificial intelligence that can, given no information but uh, questions posed to it can appear to an observer as being a human, right? That a human is answering these questions.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about that in a paper, or maybe it was an article, I don't remember, but it's called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, and he devised the Turing Test. But before that, he wrote a paper called On Computable Numbers with Applications to the, this is where my German is really going to fail me here, Entscheidungsproblem. And the Entscheidungsproblem was a famous logical proposition that how do we decide if a logical proposition can be solved at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how that applies, how he applied that to computing science is by devising the Turing machine. And the Turing machine is this logical this operator that works on a tape, infinitely long tape of instructions, and can execute them and solve problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so why he created the Turing machine was to say, well, if a problem can be encoded in this using in an algorithm that can run on the Turing machine, then it's a decidable problem. That's the Entscheidungsproblem applied to computing science. And so if you can devise that algorithm, then it's a decidable problem. But then he took it another level on top of that and said, well, is there a machine that you can devise that, given any program, can decide if it's going to halt? And what halt means is, will it come to a solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the halting problem is and ultimately he used this Turing machine and some logical inferences to come to the idea that no, there is no machine that can do that, because even if you had a machine that you could feed a program in and its inputs and it said yes it does halt or no it does not halt, you can further augment that machine by saying when it does halt, just go into an infinite loop, and otherwise if it doesn't halt, then you just say that it doesn't halt. Mm-hmm. And then you encapsulate that all into its own machine and then feed in that program with itself as its arguments. And then you achieve some kind of contradiction. It's really, really mind-bending stuff.
No, I mean, and obvious. So this is great. I am now seeing all of this in a philosophical light. Like, obviously, these types of questions are highly philosophical in nature, and yet they also apply, right? Like there is, like this stuff does come up in computer science, and not just in class.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's super interesting, man. I mean, it's so funny. Like the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, right? Like now I want to go spend a month learning about Turing and metal and ancient Egypt and
this is and just Turing, because he bridges so many disciplines like this. It's such a huge rabbit hole, and even his own life in itself is unbelievably interesting,
right?
And a tragedy, really.
Yes, absolutely.
A tragedy of the deepest, darkest sort. And
what's the movie?
I think it's the Enigma. No, the
Something Minds, is that it? Anyway,
no.
We'll put a link in the show notes. You know the one I'm talking about, and I there's a great movie. Anybody that wants to know about Turing's life in easy to digest way, I would encourage them to. It won't make you an expert, but it definitely shines a light on some of his accomplishments and challenges.
The Imitation Game. That's it.
That's it. Right. Exactly. Yeah, it was a good movie.
That's one of the headings in his computing machinery paper, I believe.
Aha. Yeah, dude. Ugh. We need to talk more often. Because I get smarter just listening to what you're working on. I don't want to cut you off. Like, this is super interesting. I did kind of have in my mind that I would ask you about stuff you're making, but I feel like maybe we should just come back to that on another show sometime. I know you kind of demurred when I was talking to you about that before we, scheduled this. But for instance, you have a habit of making games, which I think is super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we have more to say about like, I'm not trying to close the conversation down. Maybe you have more to say about getting smarter, and we should stay there. I kind of gonna leave it up to you. Like, I know you'll be interesting either way. What should we talk? What should we change over, or should we keep good on this front, or what do you think?
Well, let's do both at the same time. That kind
Perfect.
of fits the theme,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, that's the theme completely. Absolutely.
So when you originally reached out to me and asked me if I would do this, I thought, well, I don't know what I create, but that got me down thinking, what is creation itself, right? What's the act of creation? And I know we could go off on this for a long time, but
As one does whenever somebody asks that, hey, what are you making lately? Let me think about the nature of creation. This is why I wanted you on the show, Fogus. Go ahead.
Well, I thought, what would be, if I could create anything, what would be the ideal thing for me to want to create? And I think I came to an answer. I think
give me a second.
All right.
All right, go ahead. I think I'm ready.
I think for me, the ultimate creation is a highly influential nothing. And what I mean by that is, what are some of the most influential things that were never created, right? And a couple, like, let's say, Jodorowsky's Dune, right? Philip K. Dick's The Owl in Daylight, Bush's Memex, Alan Kay's Dynabook, right?
Okay, yep.
And even Turing's machine, right?
Sure.
These are all things that were never artifacts, but to this day influence the course of history, influence people's lives, what they spend their passions on, what they spend their mind space on. And that, to me, would be the ideal creation. A nothing that drives people crazy.
The Fogus construct, the Fogus conundrum, the Fogus mystique. I don't know. Yeah. I'm naming metal bands now, I think. But anyway, go ahead.
They could be. I don't know what that is. I haven't thought of it yet. But maybe I'll keep pushing on that.
The Fogus paradox. I think that might have to be it.
The Fogus paradox. Well, now I just need to work backwards from the name.
That's right. Well, like we said, constraints are good, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. I mean, crazy interesting, actually. So, is this an actual goal of yours now? I mean, are you? I know that you're a little bit joking, right? A little bit, but I can't actually tell how much.
There is a little bit of tongue in cheek there, but having created software systems that require constant attention and maintenance and catering is not the game that I want to be in right now. In fact, if I'm thinking about something that I am creating and someone out there in the world wants it or finds it useful, then I've got to go back to the drawing board.
Okay, interesting.
So there is a seriousness to it, and so the apex of the ideal is, how can I get away with creating nothing that is highly influential? I still need to work on that.
There's a level of meta here that makes it obvious to me a number of things. First of all, why you were drawn to philosophy and math, right? Because both of those activities um, are sort of self-referential, sort of circularly, not circular, but like there's a sort of spiraling of abstraction, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hochstetler spoke at Strange Loop one year, and I was there, and I think you might have been there at the same one. Were you there for that?
I did. I wasn't able to see that talk, however.
Sure, the talk is online. I'll link it in the show notes. The thing that he said that really struck me was he was talking about his journey um, through math as a mathematician, at the PhD level, and he talked about hitting his abstraction ceiling, which I thought it really, really took me aback to hear Doug Hochstetler talk about essentially getting to a point where he's not smart enough to go any further, right? Because of course he's, brilliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, this idea that there is a limit, but that it's quite different for different people, I find just really humbling and fascinating. Like I've been really fortunate in my career to work with some incredible engineers who have done things that I think I'm probably not capable of, which is okay. I'm good at other things. But it's just interesting to run into that and this notion of Hochstetler's that there's an abstraction ceiling,
Mm-hmm.
and your abstraction ceiling, I will say, is higher than mine, at least for a lot of things. I think, which is a compliment. I like to think mine is reasonably high. But yours is high, and so I feel like that you're coming at this in a direction that kind of just makes sense to me, which is you know the meta, right? Because that's really useful, right? Abstractions are super powerful when you can
Mm-hmm.
see two things as being the same thing. Like it's incredibly enabling. Like a lot of my advancement in the art of software engineering has been about overcoming my inability to perceive certain abstractions at various stages throughout my career. So I, all I guess I'm trying to say is from way down here, it feels like you're on the right track with that, right? Because like if you're going at it from that direction, then if it works, it's going to be a powerful technique for getting you there.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I don't know.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I've wasted a whole bunch of time.
Maybe. I mean, that's another thing I've talked about on the show before, which is, the sign on my shop door that says slow. I think I've mentioned it every
Mm-hmm.
episode now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the notion there being that the pursuit is worthy, right? Like the actual pursuit is worthy. Like, even if all I make is a pile of slag or sawdust or whatever, that's not. I mean, obviously one wants to work in an effective way, right? Like it's not good to walk into my shop and then just randomly set something on fire for no purpose. That's not useful. But like that the activity itself is worthwhile, is worth doing, has a positive effect, even if it's just in occupying that moment in a way that is somehow aesthetically pleasing, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
No, it does, and I would love to get a sign like that and just meditate on it. It's so great.
I'll make you one.
Slow.
Yeah.
I would love that. I
Okay,
would love
cool.
that.
I'll put it on the project list. Should be done about 3022, the year 3022.
Well, that'll be about the same time that I've come up with this paradox that you were talking
Perfect. It'll be a great gift for your launch party.
about.
Because I mean, at that point, slow will seem incredibly appropriate. Awesome. Well, I know we could go on for another hour, but I do like to have mercy on the listeners' ears. It might be a good point here to sort of flip over to our final question. But before I do that, I always like to make sure that I ask the guests and say, and leave room for, closing down any things that we need to close down or stuff that hasn't been mentioned that would be great to mention. So before we go to our final question, Vogus, is there anything else we should get through before we take it there?
No, I think if I bring up any more topics, we might just go down another rabbit hole. So
Yeah, totally.
Ask away.
Okay,
Ask
cool.
away.
Yeah. So our final question, as always, is the one I stole from your company's show, the one I used to host, which is the question about advice. So I always ask our guests for a piece of advice, which could be anything. It could be advice you were given, or advice that you think should be given, or advice that you like to give. Anything at all, really. What a good piece of advice from you for our listeners?
Sure. Well, I don't know. I don't know who might be listening to this, but I think the advice I'll give is one that I'll give to my younger self, and maybe that'll help. And that is the old koan that says, "If you encounter Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha."
I will definitely have to think about that one a bunch, because I clearly do not grok, but that does not mean I don't like it. I like it a lot. It's going to make me think, just like talking to you always makes me think in a really good way, even if we're just chatting, which just one of the reasons that I regret not making more time to do that. So we'll have to do that. But we will draw, I think, this conversation to a close. Dude, thank you so much for, sitting down to talk to me. Like, really just absolutely fascinatingly interesting stuff. We absolutely have to have you back on, because I want to talk more about some of the things that you've made, but also to, find out how you're doing on your journey towards enlightenment or additional enlightenment. So we'll have to have you back on. But thanks so much for coming on today and having this conversation with me.
It was a true pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise, absolutely. All right, well. You have been listening to Get Smarter and Make Stuff. I'm your host, Craig Andera. Visit the show online at getsmarterandmakestuff.com. That's all spelled out, all one word. Go there to subscribe to and comment on the show, read the blog, view the gallery, and find a link to the Get Smarter and Make Stuff YouTube channel. Come on by. We're also on Twitter at MakeSmartStuff. If you enjoyed the show and feel like sharing with others you think might like it too, I'd certainly appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.